Mort, Part 8. Mort thought that history was thrashing around like a steel hawser with the tension off, twanging backwards and forwards across reality in great destructive sweeps. History isn't like that. History unravels gently like an old sweater. It has been patched and darned many times, re-knitted to suit different people, shoved in a box under the sink of censorship to be cut up for the dusters of propaganda, yet it always, eventually, manages to spring back into its old familiar shape. History has a habit of changing the people who think they're changing it. History always has a few tricks up its frayed sleeve. It's been around a long time. This is what was happening. The misplaced stroke of Mort's scythe had cut history into two separate realities. In the city of Stolat, Princess Keeley still ruled, with a certain amount of difficulty and with the full-time aid of the royal recognizer, who was put on the court payroll and charged with the duty of remembering that she existed. In the lands outside, though, beyond the plain, in the ramtops around the Circle Sea, all the way to the rim, the traditional reality still held sway, and she was quite definitely dead, the Duke was king, and the world was proceeding sedately according to plan, whatever the plan may be. The point is that both realities were true. The sort of historical event horizon was currently about 20 miles away from the city and wasn't yet very noticeable. That's because call it the difference in historical pressures wasn't yet that great. But it was growing. Out in the damp cabbage fields, there was a shimmer in the air and a faint sizzle like frying grasshoppers. People don't alter history any more than birds alter the sky, that they just make brief patterns in it. Inch by inch, implacable as a glacier and far colder, the real reality was grinding back towards Stolat. Mort was the first person to notice. It had been a long afternoon. The mountaineer had held on to his icy handhold until the very last moment, and the executee had called Mort a lackey of the monarchist state. Only the old lady of 103, who had gone to her reward surrounded by her sorrowing relatives, had smiled at him and said he was looking a little pale. The disk sun was close to the horizon by the time that Binky cantered wearily through the skies over Stolat, and Mort looked down and saw the borderland of reality. It curved away below him, a crescent of faint silver mist. He didn't know what it was, but he had a nasty foreboding that it had something to do with him. He reined in the horse and allowed him to trot gently towards the ground, touching down a few yards behind the wall of iridescent air. He was moving at something less than a walking pace, hissing gently as it drifted ghost-like across the stark, damp cabbage fields and frozen drainage ditches. It was a cold night, and the type of night when frost and fog fight for domination, and every sound is therefore muffled. Binky's breath made fountains of cloud in the still air. He whinnied gently, almost apologetically, and pawed at the ground. Mort slid out of the saddle and crept up to the interface. It crackled softly. Weird shapes coruscated across it, flowing and shifting and disappearing once again. After some searching, he found a stick and poked it cautiously into the wall. It made strange ripples that wobbled slowly out of sight. Mort looked up as the shape drifted overhead. It was a black owl, patrolling the ditches for anything small and squeaky. It hit the wall with a splash of sparkling mist, leaving an owl-shaped ripple that grew and spread until it joined the boiling kaleidoscope, and then it vanished. Mort could see through the transparent interface, and certainly no owl reappeared on the other side. Just as he was puzzling over this, there was another soundless splash a few feet away. The bird burst into view again, totally unconcerned, and skimmed away across the fields. Mort pulled himself together and stepped through the barrier, which was no barrier at all. It just tinkled. A moment later, Binky burst through after him, eyes rolling in desperation and tendrils of interface catching on his hooves. He reared up, shaking his mane like a dog to remove clinging fibers of mist, and looked at Mort beseechingly. Mort caught his bridle and patted him on the nose and fumbled in his pocket for a rather grubby sugar lump. He was aware that he was in the presence of something important, but he wasn't quite yet sure what that was. There was a road running between an avenue of damp and gloomy willow trees. Mort remounted and steered Binky across the field into the dripping darkness underneath the branches. In the distance he could see the lights of Stow Hillet, which really wasn't much more of a small town, and a faint glow on the edge of sight must be Stolat. He looked at it longingly. The barrier worried him. He could see it creeping across the field beyond the trees. Mort was on the point of urging Binky back into the air when he saw the light immediately ahead of him, warm and beckoning. It was spilling from the windows of a large building set back from the road. It was probably a cheerful sort of light in any case, but in these surroundings and compared with Mort's mood, it was positively ecstatic. As he rode nearer, he saw shadows moving against it and made out of a few snatches of song. It was an inn, and inside there were people having a good time, or what passed for a good time if you were a peasant and spent most of your time closely concerned with cabbages. Compared to brassicas, practically anything was fun. There were human beings in there doing uncomplicated human things like getting drunk and forgetting the words of songs. Mort had never really felt homesick, possibly because his mind had been too occupied with other things, but he felt it now, for the first time, a sort of longing not for a place, but for a state of mind, for being just an ordinary human being with straightforward things to worry about, like money, sickness, or the people. I shall have a drink, he thought, and perhaps I shall feel better. There was an open-fronted stable on one side of the main building. He led Binky into the warm, horse-smelling darkness that already accommodated 3 other horses. As Mort unfastened the nose bag, he wondered if Death's horse felt the same way about the other horses, which had rather less supernatural lifestyles. He certainly looked impressive compared to the others, which regarded him watchfully. Binky was a real horse. The blisters of the shovel handle on Mort's hands were a testimony to that, and compared to the others he looked more real than ever, more solid, more horsey, slightly larger than life. In fact, Mort was on the verge of making an important deduction, and it is unfortunate that he was distracted as he walked across the yard to the inn's low door by the sight of the inn's sign. Its artist hadn't been particularly gifted, but there was no mistaking the line of Qa'Rajh's jaw or her mass of fiery hair in the portrait of the Queen's head. He sighed and pushed the door open. As one man, the assembled company stopped talking and stared at him with the most honest rural stare that suggests that for 2 pins they'll hit you around the head with a shovel and bury your body under a compost heap at full moon. It might be worth taking another look at Mort, because he's changed a lot in the last few chapters. For example, while he still has plenty of knees and elbows about his person, they seem to have migrated to their more normal places, and he no longer moves as though his joints were loosely fastened together with elastic bands. He used to look as if he knew nothing at all. Now he looks as though he knew too much. Something about his eyes suggests that he has seen things ordinary people never see, or at least never see more than once. Something about all the rest of him suggests to the watchers that causing an inconvenience for this boy might be just as wise as kicking a wasp nest. In short, Mort no longer looks like something the cat brought in and then brought up. The landlord relaxed his grip on the stout blackthorn peacemaker he kept under the bar and composed his features into something resembling a cheerful, welcoming grin, although not very much. "Evening, your lordship," he said. "What's your pleasure this cold and frosty night?" "What?" said Mort, blinking in the light. "What he means is, what you want to drink," said a small ferret-faced man sitting by the fire, who was giving Mort the kind of look a butcher gives a field full of lambs. I don't know," said Mort. "Do you sell starter?" "Never heard of it, lordship." Mort looked around at the faces watching him, illuminated by the firelight. They were the sort of people generally called the salt of the earth. In other words, they were hard, square, and bad for your health, but Mort was too preoccupied to notice. "What do people like to drink here, then?" The landlord looked sideways at his customers, a clever trick, given that they were directly in front of him. "Why, lordship, we drink scumble for preference." "Scumble?" said Mort, failing to notice the muffled sniggers. "Aye, lordship, made from apples. Well, mainly apples." This seemed healthy enough to Mort. "Oh, right, a pint of scumble, then." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a bag of gold that Death had given him. It was still quite full. In the sudden hush of the inn, the faint clink of the coins sounded like the legendary bass gongs of Lesp, which can be heard as far out to sea on stormy nights as the currents stir them in their drowned towers 300 fathoms below. "And please serve these gentlemen with whatever they want," he added. He was so overwhelmed by the chorus of thanks that he didn't take much notice to the fact that his new friends were served their drinks in tiny, thimble-sized glasses, while his alone turned up in a large wooden mug. A lot of stories are told about scumble and how it's made out of damp marshes according to an ancient recipe handed down rather unsteadily from father to son. It is not true about the rats, or the snakeheads, or the lead shot. The one about the dead sheep is a complete fabrication as well. We can lay to rest all the variations of the one about the trouser button. But the one about not letting it come into contact with metal is absolutely true, because when the landlord frequently short-changed Mort and plonked the small heap of copper in a puddle of the stuff, it immediately began to froth. Mort sniffed his drink and then took a sip. It tasted something like apples, something like autumn mornings, and quite a lot like the bottom of a log pile. Not wishing to appear disrespectful, however, he took a swig, the crowd watching, counting under its breath. Mort felt something was being demanded of him. Nice, he said. Very refreshing. And took another sip. Bit of an acquired taste, he added, but well worth the effort, I'm sure. There were one or two mutters of discontent from the back of the crowd. He's been watering the scumble, that's what it is. Aye, thou knows what happens if you lets a drop of water touch scumble. The landlord tried to ignore this. You like it? He said to Mort, in pretty much the same tone of voice people use when they said to St. George, "You killed a what?" It's quite tangy, said Morton, sort of nutty. Excuse me, said the landlord, and gently took the mug out of Mort's hand. He sniffed at it, then wiped his eyes. Ugh. That's the right stuff, all right. He looked at the boy with something verging on admiration. It wasn't that he'd drunk a third of the pint of a scum in itself. It was that he was still vertical and apparently very much alive. He handed the pot back again, as it was as if Mort was being given a trophy after some incredible contest. When the boy took another mouthful, several of the watchers winced. The landlord wondered what Mort's teeth were made of, and decided it must be the same stuff as his stomach. "You're not a wizard by any chance?" he inquired. "Just in case." Sorry, no. Should I be?" "I didn't think so," thought the landlord. "He doesn't walk like a wizard, and anyway he isn't smoking anything." He looked at the scumble pot again. There was something wrong about this. There was something wrong about the boy. He didn't look right. He looked more solid than he should do. That was ridiculous, of course. The bar was solid, the floors were solid, the customers were as solid as you could wish for. Yet Mort, standing there looking rather embarrassed and casually sipping a liquid you could clean spoons with, seemed to emit a particular potent sort of solidness, an extra dimension of realness, if it were. His hair was more hairy, his clothes were more clothy, his boots the epitome of bootness. It made your head ache just to look at him. However, Mort then demonstrated that he was human after all. The mug dropped from his stricken fingers and clattered on the flagstones, where dregs of scumble started to eat its way through them. He pointed at the far wall, his mouth opening and shuddering wordlessly. The regulars turned back to their conversation and games of shovel-up, reassured that things were as they should be. Mort was acting perfectly normal now. The landlord, relieved that the brew had been vindicated, reached across the bar top and patted him companionably on his shoulder. "That's all right," he said. "I often take people like this. You'll just have a headache for a few weeks. Don't worry about it. A drop of scumble and see you right bright as rain again." It is a fact that the best remedy for a scumble hangover is hair of the dog, although it should more accurately be called a tooth of the shark, or possibly a tread of the bulldozer. But Mort merely went on pointing and said in a trembling voice, "Can't you see it? It's coming through the wall. It's coming right through the wall." "A lot of things come through the wall after your first drink of scumble. Green hairy things, usually. It's the mist. Can't you hear it sizzling?" "A sizzling mist, is it?" The landlord looked at the wall, which was quite empty and unmysterious except for a few cobwebs. The urgency in Mort's voice, however, unsettled him. He would have preferred the normal scaly monsters. A man knew where he stood with those. "It's coming right across the room. Can't you feel it?" The customers looked at one another. Mort was now making them uneasy. One or two of them admitted later that they did feel something rather like an icy tingle, but that could just have been indigestion. Mort backed away, then gripped the bar. He shivered for a moment. "Look," said the landlord, "a joke's a joke, but you had a green shirt on before." The landlord looked down. There was an edge of terror in his voice. "Before what?" he quavered. To his astonishment, and before his hand could complete its surreptitious journey towards the blackthorn stick, Mort lunged across the bar and grabbed him by the apron. "You got a green shirt, haven't you?" he said. "I saw it. It had little yellow buttons." "Well, yes, I got 2 shirts." The landlord tried to draw himself up a little. "I'm a man of means," he added. "I just didn't wear it today." He didn't want to know how Mort knew about the buttons. Mort let him go and spun around. They're all sitting in different places. Where's the man that was sitting by the fire? It's all changed." He ran out through the door, and there was a muffled cry from outside. He dashed back wild-eyed and confronted the horrified crowd. "Who changed the sign? Someone changed the sign." The landlord nervously ran his tongue across his lips. "After the old king died, you mean?" he said. Mort's look chilled him. The boy's eyes were two black pools of terror. "Its name, I mean." "Oh, it's always been the same name," said the man, looking desperately at his customers for support. "Isn't it so, lads? The Duke's head." Mort stared at everyone, visibly shaking. Then he turned and ran outside again. The listeners heard hoofbeats in the yard, which grew fainter, then disappeared entirely, just as though a horse had left the face of the earth. There was no sound inside the inn. Men tried to avoid one another's gaze. No one wanted to be the first to admit to seeing what he thought he had just seen. So it was left to the landlord to walk unsteadily across the room, reach out and run his fingers across the familiar, reassuring wooden surface of the door. It was solid, unbroken, and everything that a good door really should be. Everyone had seen Mort run through it 3 times, and never once had he opened it. Binky fought for height, rising nearly vertically with his hooves thrashing in the air, his breath curling away behind him like a vapor trail. Mort hung on with knees and hands, with mostly willpower, his face buried in the horse's mane. He didn't look down until the air around him was freezing and thin as workhouse gravy. Overhead, the hoplights flickered silently across the winter sky. Below, an upturned saucer miles across, silvery in the starlight. He could see the lights through it. Clouds were drifting through it. No, he watched carefully. Clouds were certainly drifting into it, and there were clouds in it, but the clouds inside were wispier and moving in a slightly different direction, and in fact didn't seem to have much to do with the clouds outside. There was something else. Oh, yes, the hoplights. They gave the night outside the ghostly hemisphere a faint green tint, but there was no sign of it under the dome. It was like looking into a piece of another world, almost identical, that had been grafted on to the disk. The weather was slightly different in there, and the lights weren't on display tonight. And the disk was resenting it and surrounding it and pushing it back into non-existence. Mort couldn't see it growing smaller from up here, but in his mind's ear he could hear the locust sizzle of the thing as it ground across the land, changing things back to where they should be. Reality was healing itself. Mort knew, without even having to think about it, who was at the center of the dome. It was so obvious even from here that it was centered firmly on Stow-Lat. He tried not to think what would happen when the dome had shrunk to the size of the room, and then the size of a person, and then the size of an egg. He failed. Logic would have told Mort that here was his salvation. In a day or two the problem would solve itself, the books in the library would be right again, the world would have sprung back into shape like an elastic bandage. Logic would have told him that interfering with the process a second time around would only make things even worse. Logic would have said all that, if only logic hadn't taken the night off too. Lights travel quite slowly on the disk due to the braking effect of the huge magical field, and currently that part of the rim carrying the island of Qa'Rajh was directly under the little sun's orbit, and it was, therefore, still early evening. It was also quite warm, since the rim picks up more heat and enjoys a gentle maritime climate. In fact, Qa'Rajh, which with a large part of what, for want of a better word, must be called its coastline sticking out over the edge, was a fortunate island. The only native Krollians who did not appreciate this were those who didn't look where they were going, or who walked in their sleep, and, because of the natural selection, there weren't many of them left anymore. All societies have their share of dropouts, but on Qa'Rajh they never had a chance to drop back in again. Terpsic Mims was not a dropout. He was an angler. There's a difference. Angling is more expensive. But Terpsic was happy. He was watching a feather on a cork bob on the gentle reed-lined waters on the Qa'Rajh River, and his mind was very nearly blank. The only thing that could have disturbed his mood was actually catching a fish, because catching fish was the one thing about angling that he really did not like. They were cold and slimy and panicky and got on his nerves, and Terpsic's nerves weren't very good to begin with. So long as he caught nothing, Terpsic Mims was one of the district's happiest anglers because Hackrell River was 5 miles from his home, and therefore 5 miles from Mrs. Gladys Mims, with whom he had enjoyed six happy months of married life. That, however, had been some 20 years ago. Terpsic did not pay undue heed when another angler took up station further along the bank. Of course, some fishermen might have objected to this breach of etiquette, but in Terpsic's book, anything that reduced his chance of actually catching any of the damn things was in fact all right. Out of the corner of his eye, he noted that the newcomer was fly fishing, an interesting pastime which Terpsic had always had rejected because one spent altogether far too much time at home making the equipment. He had never seen fly fishing done like this before. There were wet flies and there were dry flies, but this fly augured into the water with a saw-tooth whine and dragged the fish out backwards. Terpsic watched in horrified fascination as the indistinct figure behind the willow trees cast and cast over and over again. The water boiled as the river's entire piscine population fought to get out of the way of the buzzing terror, and unfortunately, a large and maddened pike now took Terpsic hook out of sheer confusion. One moment he was standing on the bank, and the next he was in the green, clanging doom, bubbling his breath away, and watching his life flash before his eyes, and even in the moment of drowning, dreading the thought of watching the bit between the day of his wedding and the present. It occurred to him that Gladys would soon be a widow, which cheered him up a little bit. In fact, Terpsic had always tried to look on the bright side, and it struck him as he sank gratefully into the silt that from this point on his whole life could actually only improve. A hand grabbed his hair and dragged him to the surface, which was suddenly full of pain. Ghastly blue and black blotches swam in front of his eyes, his lungs were on fire, his throat was a pipe of agony. Hands, cold hands, freezing hands, hands that felt like a glove full of dice, towed him through the water and threw him down on the bank, where after some game attempts to get on with drowning, he was eventually bullied back into what passed for his life. Terpsic didn't often get angry, because Gladys didn't hold with it, but he felt cheated. He'd been born without being consulted, he'd been married because Gladys and her father had seen to it, and the only major human achievement that was uniquely his had been rudely snatched away from him. A few seconds ago it had all been very simple. Now it was back to being complicated. And now, not that he wanted to die, of course, the gods were very firm on the subject of suicide, he just had not want to be rescued. Through red eyes in a mask of slime and duckweed, he peered at the blurred form above him and shouted, "Why did you have to save me?" The answer worried him, and he thought about it as he squelched all the way home. It sat at the back of his mind while Gladys complained about the state of his clothes. It swirled around in his head as he sat and sneezed guiltily by the fire because being ill was another thing that Gladys didn't hold with. As he lay shivering in bed, it settled in his dreams like an iceberg. In the midst of his fever, he muttered, what did he mean by "for later"? Torches flared in the city of Stolat. Whole squads of men were charged with the task of constantly renewing them. The streets glowed, the sizzling flames pushed back the shadows that had been blamelessly minding their own business every night for centuries. They illuminated ancient corners where the eyes of bewildered rats glittered in the depths of their holes. They forced burglars to stay indoors. They glowed on the night mists, forming a nimbus of yellow light that blotted out the cold, high flames streaming from the hub. But mainly, they shone on the face of Princess Keely. It was everywhere. It was plastered every flat surface. Binky cantered along the glowing streets between Princess Keely on doors, walls, and gable ends. Mort gaped at the posts of his beloved on every surface where workmen had been able to make paste stick. Even stranger, no one seemed to be paying them much attention. While Stolat's nightlife was not as colorful or full of incident as that of Ankh-Morpork, in the same way that a waste paper basket cannot compete with a municipal tip, the streets were nevertheless abustle with people and shrill with the cries of hucksters, gamblers, sellers of sweetmeats, pea and thimplemen, ladies of assignation, pickpockets, and the occasional honest trader who had wandered in by mistake and couldn't now raise enough money to leave. As Mort rode through them, snatches of conversation in half a dozen languages floated into his ears. With numb acceptance, he realized he could understand every single one of them. He eventually dismounted and led the horse along Wall Street, searching in vain for Cutwell's house. He found it only because a lump on the nearest poster was making muffled swearing noises. He reached out gingerly and pulled aside a strip of paper. "Thanks very much," said the gargoyle door knocker. "You wouldn't credit it, would you? 1 minute life as normal, the next minute a mouthful of glue. Where's Cutwell?" "He's gone off to the palace." The knocker leered at him and winked a cast iron eye. "Some men came and took all his stuff away. Then some other men started pasting pictures of his girlfriend all over the place. Bath turds," it added. Mort colored. His girlfriend. The door knocker, being of the demonic persuasion, sniggered at his tone. It sounded like fingernails being dragged over a file. "Yes," it said. "They seemed in a bit of a hurry, if you ask me." Mort was already up on Binky's back. "I say," shouted the knocker at his retreating back. "I say, could you unstick me, boy?" Mort tugged on Binky's reins so hard that the horse reared and danced crazily backwards across the cobbles, then reached out and grabbed the ring of the knocker. The gargoyle looked up into his face and suddenly felt like a very frightened door knocker indeed. Mort's eyes glowed like crucibles. His expression was a furnace. His voice held enough heat to melt iron. He didn't know what he could do, but felt that he would prefer also to not find out. "What did you call me?" Mort hissed. The door knocker thought quickly. "Sir?" it said. "What did you ask me to do? Unstick me?" "I don't intend to." Fine, said the door knocker. "That's okay by me. I'll just stick around then." It watched Mort canter off along the street. Sudden shuddered with relief, knocking itself gently in its nervousness. "A narrow squeak," said one of the hinges. "Foot up." Mort passed night watchmen whose job now appeared to consist of ringing bells and shouting the name of the princess, but a little uncertainly, as if they had difficulty remembering it. He ignored them, because he was listening to voices inside his head, which went, "She only met you once, you fool. Why should she bother about you? Yes, but I did save her life. That means it belongs to her, not to you. Besides, he's a wizard. So what? Wizards aren't supposed to go out with girls. They're to celebrate." "Celebrate?" They're not supposed to, you know." "What? Never any you know at all," said the internal voice, and it sounded as if it was grinning. "It's supposed to be bad for the magic," thought Mort bitterly. Funny place to keep magic. Mort was shocked. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I'm you, Mort. Your inner self." "Well, I'd wish you get out of my head. It's quite crowded enough with me in here." "Fair enough," said the voice. "I was only trying to help. But remember, if you ever need you, you're always around." The voice now faded away. "Well," thought Mort bitterly, "that must have been me. I'm the only one that called me Mort." The shock of realization quite obscured the fact that while Mort had been locked into the monologue, he had ridden right through the gates of the palace. Of course, people rode through the gates of the palace every day, but most of them needed things to be opened first. The guards on the other side were rigid with fear because they thought they'd seen a ghost. They would have been far more frightened if they had known that a ghost was almost exactly what they hadn't seen. The guard outside the doors of the great hall had seen it too, but he had time to gather his wits, or such that remained, and raised his spear as Binky trotted across the courtyard. "Halt!" he croaked. "Halt! Who goes there?" Mort saw him for the first time. "What?" he said, still lost in thought. The guard ran his tongue over his dry lips and backed away. Mort slid off of Binky's back and walked forward. "I meant, what goes there?" The guard tried again, with a mixture of doggedness and suicidal stupidity that marked him for an early promotion. Mort caught the spear gently and lifted it out of the way of the door. As he did so, the torchlight illuminated his face. "Mort," he said softly. It should have been enough for any normal soldier, but this guard was officer material. I mean, friend or foe," he stuttered, trying to avoid Mort's gaze. "Which would you prefer?" he grinned. It wasn't quite the grin of his master, but in its own it was a pretty effective grin, and it did not have a single trace of humor in it. The guard sagged relief and finally stood aside. "Pass, friend," he said. Mort strode across the hall towards the staircase that led up to the royal apartments. The hall had changed a lot since he last saw it. Portraits of Keeley were everywhere, that even replaced the ancient and crumbling battle banners in the shadowy heights of the roof. Anyone walking through the palace would have found it impossible to go more than a few steps without seeing a portrait. Part of Mort's mind wondered why, and as another part worried about the flickering dome that was steadily closing in on the city. But most of his mind was a hot, steamy glow of rage, bewilderment, and jealousy. Isabel had been right, he thought. This must be love. He jerked his head up. Cotwell was standing at the top of his... The walk through walls, boy. He jerked his head up. Cotwell was standing at the top of the stairs. The wizard had changed a lot too, Mort thought, bitterly. Perhaps not that much, though. Although he was wearing a black and white robe embroidered with the sequins, although his pointy hat was a yard high and decorated with more mystic symbols than a dental chart, and although his red velvet shoes had silver buckles and toes that curled like snails, there were still a few stains on his collar, and he appeared to be chewing. He watched Mort climb the stairs toward him. "Are you angry about something?" he said. "I started work, but I got rather tied up with other things. Very difficult. Very, very difficult walking through. Why are you looking at me like that?" "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question. Would you like a strawberry?" Mort glanced at the small wooden punnet in the wizard's hands. "In midwinter. Actually, they are sprouts with a dash of enchantment." "They taste like strawberries?" Cotwell sighed and agreed. "No, like sprouts. The spell isn't totally efficient. I thought they might cheer the princess up, but she threw them at me. Shame to waste them. Be my guest." Mort gaped at him. "She threw them at you." "Very accurately, I'm afraid. A very strong-minded young lady." "Hi," said a voice in the back of Mort's mind. "It's you again," pointing out to yourself that the chances of the princess even contemplating with this fellow are on the far side of remote. Go away, thought Mort. His subconscious was worrying him. It appeared to have a direct line to parts of his body that he wanted to ignore at the moment. "Why are you here?" he said aloud. "Is it something to do with all these pictures?" "Good idea, wasn't it?" beamed Cotwell. "I'm rather proud of it myself." "Excuse me," said Mort weakly. "I've had a busy day. I think I'd like to sit down somewhere." There's the throne room," said Cotwell. "There's no one in there at this time of night. Everyone's asleep." Mort nodded and then looked suspiciously at the young wizard. "What are you doing up there?" he said. Said Cotwell. I just thought I'd see if there was, anything in the pantry." He shrugged. There had, in fact, been half a jar of elderly mayonnaise, a piece of very old cheese, and a tomato with white mold growing on it, since during the day the pantry of the Palace of Stolat normally contained 15 whole stacks, 100 brace of partridges, 50 hogsheads of butter, 200 jugs of hares, 75 sides of beef, 2 miles of assorted sausages, various fowls, 80 dozen eggs, several Circle C sturgeon, a vat of caviar, and an elephant's leg stuffed with olives. Cotwell had learned once again that the one universal manifestation of raw natural magic throughout the universe is this, that any domestic food store raided furtively in the middle of the night always contains, no matter what its daytime inventory, half a jar of elderly mayonnaise, a piece of very old cheese, and a tomato with white mold growing. Now is the time to report that Cotwell too noticed that Mort, even Mort weary with riding and lack of sleep, is somehow glowing from within, and in some strange way, unconnected with size, is nevertheless larger than life. The difference is that Cotwell is, by training, a better guesser than other people, and knows that in occult matters the obvious answer is usually the wrong one. Mort can absent-mindedly move through walls and drink neat Widowmaker soberly, not because he is turning into a ghost, but because he is becoming dangerously real. In fact, as the boys stumbles while they walk along the silent corridors and steps through a marble pillar without noticing, it's obvious that the world is becoming a pretty unsubstantial place from his point of view. "You just walked through a marble pillar," observed Cotwell. "How did you do it?" "Did I?" Mort looked around. The pillar looked sound enough. He poked an arm towards it and slightly bruised his elbow. "Could have sworn you did," said Cotwell. "Wizards notice these sort of things, He reached into the pocket of his robe. "Then have you noticed the mist dome around the country?" Cotwell squeaked. The jar in his hand dropped and smashed on the tiles. There was the smell of slightly rancid salad dressing. "Already?" "I don't know about already," said Mort, "but there's this sort of crackling wall sliding over the land and no one else seemed to worry about it, and how fast was it moving? It changes things." "You saw it. How far away is it? How fast is it moving?" "Of course I saw it. I rode through it twice. It was like..." "But you're not a wizard. Why? What are you doing here anyway?" Cotwell took a deep breath. "Everyone shut up!" There was silence. Then the wizard grabbed Mort's arm. "Come on," he said, pulling him back along the corridor. "I don't know who you are exactly, and I hope I got time to find out one day, but something really horrible is going to happen soon, and I think you're involved somehow." "Something terrible? When?" That depends on how far the interface is and how fast it's moving, said Codwell, dragging Mort down a side passage. When they were outside a small oak door, he let go of his arm and fumbled in his pocket again, removing a small hard piece of cheese and an unpleasantly squashy tomato. Hold these, will you? Thank you. He delved again, producing a key, and unlocked the door. It's going to kill the princess, isn't it? Said Mort. Yes, said Codwell. And then again, no. He paused with his hand on the door handle. That was pretty perspicacious of you. How did you know? Mort hesitated. She told me a very strange story, said Codwell. I expect she did, said Mort. If it was unbelievable, it was most likely true. You are him, aren't you? Death assistance. Yes, off duty at the moment, though. Pleased to hear it. Codwell shut the door behind them and fumbled for a candlestick. There was a pop, a flash of blue light, and then a whimper. Sorry, he said, sucking on his fingers. Fire spell. I never really got the hang of it. You were expecting the dome thing, weren't you? Said Mort urgently. What will happen when it closes in? The wizard sat down heavily on the remains of a bacon sandwich. I'm not exactly sure, he said. It'll be interesting to watch, but not from the inside, I'm afraid. What I think will happen is that the last week will have never existed. She'll suddenly die. You don't understand. She will have been dead for a week. All this, he waved his hand vaguely in the air, will not have happened. The assassin will have done his job, you will have done yours, history will have healed itself, everything will be all right, from history's point of view, that is. There really isn't any other. Mort stared out the narrow window. He could see across the courtyard into the glowing streets outside, where a picture of the princess smiled at the sky. Tell me about the pictures, he said. That looks like some sort of wizard thing. I'm not sure it's working. You see, people were beginning to get upset, and they didn't know why, and that only made it worse. Their minds were in one reality, and their bodies in another. Very unpleasant. They couldn't get used to the idea that she was still alive. I thought the pictures might be a good idea, but, people just don't see what their minds tells them isn't there. I could have told you that, said Mort bitterly. I had the town criers out during daytime, Codwell continued. I thought that if people could come to believe in her, then this new reality could become a real one. Said Mort. He turned away from the window. What do you mean? Well, you see, I reckon that if enough people believed in her, they could change reality. It works for gods. If people stop believing in a god, he dies. If a lot of them believe in him, he grows stronger. I didn't know that. I thought gods were just gods. They don't like it talked about, said Codwell, shuffling through the heap of books and parchment on his work table. Well, that might work for gods because they're special, said Mort. People are more solid. It wouldn't work for people. That's not entirely true. Let's suppose you went out of here and prowled around the palace. One of the guards would probably see you, and he'd think you were a thief, and he'd fire his crossbow. In his reality, you'd be a thief. It wouldn't actually be true, but you'd be just as dead if it was. Belief is powerful stuff. I'm a wizard. We know these things. Look here. He pulled a book out of the debris in front of him and opened it at the piece of bacon he'd used as a bookmark. Mort looked over his shoulder and frowned at the curly magical writing. It moved around the page, twisting and writhing at an attempt to not be read by a non-wizard, and the general effect was rather unpleasant. What is this? He said. It's the Book of Magic of Alberto Malich the Mage, said the wizard, a sort of book of magical theory. It's not a good idea to look too hard at the words. They resent it. Look, it says here. His lips moved soundlessly. Little beads of sweat sprang up on his forehead and decided to get together and go down and see what his nose was doing. His eyes watered. Some people like to settle with a good book. No one in possession of a complete set of marbles would like to settle down with a book of magic, because even the individual words have a private and vindictive life of their own, and reading them, in short, is kind of a mental Indian wrestling. Many a young wizard has tried to read a grimoire that is too strong for him, and people who have heard their screams have found only his pointy shoes with a classic wisp of smoke coming out of them, and a book which is just perhaps a little bit fatter. Things can happen to browsers in magical libraries that make having your face pulled off by tentacled monstrosities from the dungeon dimension seem a mere light massage by comparison. Fortunately, Codwell had an expurgated edition with some of the more distressing pages clamped shut, although on quiet nights he could hear the imprisoned words scritching irritably inside their prison walls like a spider trapped in a matchbox. Anyone who has ever sat next to someone wearing a Walkman will be able to imagine exactly what they sounded like. This is the bit, said Codwell. It says here that even gods have seen him before. What? Mort pointed a shaking finger at the book. Him. Codwell gave him an odd look and examined the left-hand page. There was a picture of an elderly wizard holding a book and a candlestick in an attitude of near-terminal dignity. That's not part of the magic, he said testily. That's just the author. What does it say under the picture? It says, if you have enjoyed this bloke, you may be interested in other titles by... No, right under the pictures is what I meant. That's easy, it's old Mallet himself. Every wizard knows him. I mean, he founded the university, Codwell chuckled. There's a famous statue of him in the main hall, and during Rag Week I once climbed up it and put a... Mort stared at the picture. Tell me, he said quietly, did the statue have a drip on the end of its nose? I shouldn't think so, said Codwell. It was marble, but I don't know what you're getting so worked up about. Lots of people know what he looked like. He's famous. He lived a long time ago, didn't he? 2,000 years, I think. Look, I don't know why. I bet he didn't die, though, said Mort. I bet he just disappeared one day. Did he? Codwell was silent for a moment. Funny you should say that, he said slowly. There was a legend I heard. He got up to some weird things, they say. They say he blew himself into the dungeon dimensions while trying to perform the rite of Ash Einte backwards. All they found was his hat. Tragic, really. The whole city in mourning for a day just for a hat. It wasn't even a particularly attractive hat. It had burn marks on it. Alberto Mallet, said Mort half to himself. Well, fancy that. He drummed his fingers on the table, although the sound was surprisingly muted. Sorry, said Codwell, I can't get the hang of treacle sandwiches either. I reckon the interface is moving at a slow walking pace, said Mort, licking his fingers absent-mindedly. Can't you stop it by magic? Codwell shook his head. Not me. It'd squash me flat, he said cheerfully. What'll happen to you when it arrives here, then? Oh, I'll go back to living in Wall Street. I mean, I will never have left. All this won't have happened. Pity, though. The cooking here is pretty good, and they do my laundry for free. How far away did you say it was, by the by? About 20 miles, I guess. Codwell rolled his eyes heavenwards and moved his lips. Eventually, he says, that means it'll arrive around midnight tomorrow, just in time for the coronation. Whose? Hers. But she's a queen already, isn't she? In a way, but officially she's not a queen until she's crowned. Codwell grinned, his face a pattern of shade in the candlelight, and added, if you want a way of thinking about it, then it's like the difference between stopping living and being dead. 20 minutes earlier, Mort had been feeling tired enough to take root. Now he could feel a fizzing in his blood. It was the kind of late-night frantic energy that you knew you would pay for around midday tomorrow, but for now he felt he had to have some action, or else his muscles would snap out of sheer vitality. I want to see her, he said. If you can't do anything, there might be something I can do. There's guards outside her room, said Codwell. I mentioned this merely as an observation. I don't imagine for 1 minute that they'll make the slightest difference to you.